I am a licensed clinical social worker. I'm an ASEX certified sexuality educator supervisor, and I provide therapy and trainings. I am also a past employee of the St. Louis ARC. I ran Teens in Motion, I ran the activities at R&R camp and book club and anything they throw at me, including the first healthy sexual relationships classes since the 70s.
Like Jessica, I am an ASEC certified sexuality educator. ASEC stands for the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, just because its acronyms are hard, right? I'm also a board certified behavior analyst. Um, the people that I work with currently are all adults. So everybody that I support are adults. Um, and in addition, I support my adult son who's 19. So I put in there, yeah, he's learning how to adult, but so am I. And like, aren't we all? Um, just to be able to name like some of my affiliations because that's relevant. I the organization that where I do most of my work is called Missouri Behavior Consulting. I also am a co-host for a podcast. It's called Sex Ed Book Review. Um, I currently am an adjunct professor in the Applied Behavior Analysis department at St. Louis University, and I am an adjunct professor in the Applied Behavior Analysis program at UMSL. And in addition, have taken on the very big shoes that Jessica Naslem left for me, and I'm doing my best in the formerly called Succeed, now OIPE program, and teaching the healthy relationships and healthy sexuality courses for those programs. So that's a little bit about me.
I'm Nicholas Myowite there. I'm just a big sex geek. I love pretty much delving into any topics that have to do with sexuality and sociosexual behaviors. I am an ASEX certified sexuality counselor, which does not mean that I do traditional like psychotherapy counseling. It's a weird title. It basically means that I offer a lot of specific suggestions within my licensure framework, which happens to be behavior analysis. I'm also an LGBTQIA plus family system specialist. I am co-director and owner of the Certified Behavioral Sexologist program. So I actually train other behavior analysts to do this type of work. And then I am clinical director at Empowered, a Center for Sexuality, LLC, where we work with pretty much any age group. I will say it is easiest for us to get adults with DMH waivers in for sure. But we do work with a variety of ages, and we try and make it accessible for everybody through things like sliding scale. I would like to do a land acknowledgement, so please take a moment to reflect upon the land where you currently sit and or reside. We're in St. Louis, where the land that we are privileged to reside upon was forcefully stolen from the Osage, Illini, and Missouri tribes, to name but a few. We wish to honor and pay our respects to those who lost their lives and their land, for while we were not directly involved, we recognize we do regrettably benefit from these acts of violence.
All of us are really privileged to be here today, having all worked together in capacity over the last decade. You all are really getting a treat today by having all of these fabulous folks at the table to answer some of these questions that people don't want to ask, and they certainly don't want to reach out to strangers to do so. So you've been invited to be a part of this because the St. Louis Arc finds it important that in the way that they have people in their community, they believe that they should have the ability to access relationships of all kinds. So we're showing up today because they truly believe in that part of value system in their organization, and they made this possible today, which we all appreciate. And for free, right? Bonus. Um, Now, the reason why some of you all are showing up outside, and this is a lovely free resource with some therapists, is because you have some questions about how do we talk about sexuality across the lifespan with some of the folks we support. based on some of their specific needs. Some of us are confused as to what comes next for the people that we are supporting. How do we have conversations about relationships? How do we do so in a way that honors our values and also takes into consideration the safety of the members of our community? Now, we believe, I would say as a collective group, that we do not want to deny individuals the opportunity to have relationships in whatever capacity they're able to have. And that if we do not have these conversations and instill these values with the people that we care about, again, in a more personal capacity, then they could be better and do better and also be less likely to be exploited in the future with your set of value systems that you could bring from home. Also picking apart from the community the things that you think are important to teach. For this particular activity today, we want to talk about the ring of safety because the ring of safety really just kind of solidifies the reasons why we're here, as well as a conceptual way to acknowledge all the pieces that help keep people safer and also more likely to succeed in interpersonal relationships. So as we go through this ring of safety, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out. We're going to explain a little bit of these and why they are so important in being able to understand how to deliver information, and also for some people, in what time frame is that appropriate to give in terms of developmental age. So if we are first talking about just basic privacy awareness, for a lot of this, that's where sexual self-advocacy really starts to occur, is the idea that we understand what privacy means to us, what private time means to us, not just the way our physical body is in privacy in terms of, are we allowed to be alone in the bathroom by ourselves? Are we allowed to be alone in the bedroom by ourselves? Are we allowed to shut our door and have that kind of privacy? So it's those things, as well as what are some private thoughts that are supposed to be kept private? And how do we understand when we can share those private thoughts and when we can't, right? This piece of privacy is extremely important also in combating exploitation of folks. Now, when we pair that with also understanding our bodies, what they do, what they're for, and even some slang terms, when we pair those two together, Dave Hingsberger, who is the creator of the Ring of Safety, who had done work with survivors of sexual assault who are women, found that when you introduce information about bodies with names and anatomical names as well as slang terms, and you talk about what they're for and what they do, and you give them the understanding and concept of privacy as in terms of like when people are allowed to touch and where, that is when the most disclosures of sexual abuse and sexual assault and exploitation come out. So know that moving forward, as we are having more and more conversations about sexuality, that you are opening up a line of communication that is going to give you both good and evil, right? Both things that are dark and also things that are positive and that you can, have an answer to right away. But I do want to warn everyone in advance that once we start teaching these two things, you have opened a line of communication that is extremely important and also allows you a glimpse into another individual's life that you care about. And that kind of trust, that someone who listens also makes a huge impact in how safe they are able to be, again, with all of this information.
Can I want to voice and bounce off of something that you said that I thought was so important. Like the importance of utilizing language that the individual is using, language that people in their environment will be using, and the anatomically correct language as well, right? Teaching all of those, that way, sex isn't making whoopee, or things like that. and the individual is able to communicate and really understand what's being said around them. They need to understand what making whoopee is, but they also need to know what sex is, and that those two things can be the same thing, right? So making sure that they have language that's going to be understandable to them and also can service them in the event that they want to advocate or express, communicate. They need the language that they can use in different contexts.
And their family members need to introduce that language, which I think is really important. In fact, their community and their village need to introduce that language, right? Because for generalizing purposes for some of the folks who support, everybody should be saying the same thing. So when we think about sexuality education, why is important to teach about parts and what they do?
So we have one question statement about being a parent, and go-to terms for actions and body parts are different from my child's based on what the child sees online or hears from friends. Saying that it's hard, like communication can be hard. Is there any support with that? I know you guys were kind of talking about using specific like terms, but how can you help if you're a parent and your child hears it differently through friends? How can you communicate that over clearly?
If I could interject, one of my favorite ways is saying, what does that mean? I've never heard that before. What does that mean? And having the child explain it to you. That's one way. Another way is Urban Dictionary. It's your best friend.
I was going to say Urban Dictionary and Know Your Meme. This is how we connect with the youth today.
Know your anime for some folks, right? But when we think about specific language, the importance of using medically recognized terms like penis, vagina, vulva, bottom, butthole, or anus, those things are extremely important, not just for being able to pass tests or being able to, say their parts, but also for anytime they are needing to report health and safety concerns. So if their parts are hurting, if something's happening that they don't understand, that they have the language to ask for help. If they've been touched, exploited, or hurt, it is one of the most important things in terms of being able to go through a interview with the police, as well as find justice for the individual who is exploited. Without the name of terms and the understanding and concept of privacy, which is why some of these folks are targeted to exploit. Without these things, they are more likely to get into situations with folks who will use it against them, that they don't have the information to say, I don't like that thing that you said to me, or I don't want to do that thing, because they don't know, again, some of that language around that. But also, again, for reporting purposes and for health and with a doctor, knowing those parts are extremely important in what they do.
So to affirm the things that were just shared by other panelists, and also chiming in just to add some pieces to what Jessica was sharing as far as the importance of understanding medically accurate terms in communication with doctors. The amount of education that medical professionals get on how to interact effectively with somebody who has an intellectual disability or somebody who is neurodivergent is limited or non-existent. So a gynecologist or a urologist probably has no training whatsoever on how to modify language. They don't. Anybody who has been to a doctor in their life probably knows that doctors don't do a great job as a whole on describing things in a way that's accessible for like human beings, right? So one thing that we can do in order to make certain types of medical procedures, so specifically like a pelvic exam or getting going to get a colonoscopy, these are all things that are going to involve very specific personal body parts or private body parts or middle body parts. Understanding the terminology is going to make it a little bit easier to bridge that gap so that there can be more awareness of what the heck those procedures are, what's going to happen, why it's going to happen. In part because abuse prevention is important and paramount. And I think Jessica already said great things about that. I'm not going to add to that. But part two is because everybody deserves to be able to make informed choices about their health to the extent that they're able to. So if you can't make informed choices without information. So being able to have the language that's going to unify with medical professionals is going to help. And I don't know, I was thinking also, and I'm just coming from perspective as a parent. I don't want to give the impression ever that slang is invalid, that colloquialisms are not also terms, that using terms that are maybe considered like curse words or obscenities even oftentimes universally understood. And what I don't want to suggest is that those are the only words anyone should ever use, because people are still going to use terms that they might be, just using with like their parents. Because if I were, I don't know why on earth I would be talking about my genitals with my dad. But if I were, I cannot envision this universe where this would happen. But if I were, I would probably be, a little bit more colloquial, using a term that's a little bit more general. But on the other hand, if I were having a conversation with friends or something, I might use a term that's a little bit more slang-like, right? We get to use language in different ways. So understanding those words are equivalent is also super duper important.
And maybe I wasn't clear because I also was trying to kind of highlight that we want to pair all of that so that they can be successful across contexts, right? Because different language is used in different contexts and it's valid in the different contexts. Absolutely.
And it also ties into that understanding of personal rights, right? If I know the rights of my body and I understand privacy, and I understand that I can choose the doctor that I want, or if a doctor makes me uncomfortable, I can choose not to see them anymore. That is also very important in helping them to not only develop a healthy self-concept, right? The idea that they can have set a goal to find a doctor that works for them and achieve that goal. But it's also that part of the ability to non-comply, which is just a fancy way to say no, right? I want the opportunity to say no. In fact, if we deny the opportunity to say yes or no to things, it makes it even more of a fight in many situations. As somebody who's worked in group homes, if you do not give choices and allow people to make their own way, they will fight you on anything that you have asked them to do, for the most part. Right. So we give a variety of choices, and that also helps them develop that confidence that they need to make decisions with. So that sexuality education piece goes right along with that, and giving them access to that information. And then they feel good about what they know about their body, and they're more likely to not let anybody try to take advantage of them.
Oh, so that kind of brings up, we have another question. Tips on dating. How do I find a nice partner that will treat me well? Do I need to disclose my disability to them if it's not immediately obvious?
So I'll throw out there, I'm autistic. I don't necessarily tell people that right when I get to know them. I think that people should have the opportunity to get to know us for whatever we're bringing forward. I also think, however, that, sometimes sharing what our disability is, or our, even if you don't consider it a disability or a divergence, sometimes sharing that creates a little bit of contextual awareness for others that can make it a little bit easier for them to understand specific accommodations or needs that you might have, or maybe specific like stims or repetitious behaviors you might need to engage in order to regulate and calm. So I think that it's always going to be a personal choice. There's not really, I can't tell you you should or should not. I'm gonna leave this over to the other panelists. I'm curious about their thoughts.
I also agree. There's no right way to do this. There's some people that absolutely identify in their autism and they want it front and center. They want people to know it. They want to say, I'm a sexy autistic, cis person, and I just want to, collect trains with you and go and eat macaroni and cheese. Right? There are some people that absolutely, I'm sorry, that's terrible. That was a terrible, profile. I haven't written a dating profile in quite some time. But anyhow, but the idea is that there are some people that are automatically going to see that as something that they don't want to be a part of. And for some people, they say it directly up front so that they can go ahead and just displace those folks and make their pool much smaller. And they can concentrate on the folks that are more open with the idea because they were vulnerable. And if they take the chance to be vulnerable and other people don't accept that or don't honor it in a way where it makes the person feel comfortable, then they're allowed to move on and create more opportunities to spend time with people that get them. So in some ways, that's why people will choose to say up front, I am neurospicy and this is how I roll. And for other people, they would prefer to get to know somebody because they don't want to be vulnerable right away because they know that they are not able to trust this person yet because they might have specific things that they need to be able to build trust to share that kind of work that they must do on themselves.
I think sometimes it's also not that a person is the type of person to choose one or the other. Sometimes it's again contextual awareness. If I catch that I myself have high STEM needs and I'm going to be bouncing around and moving around a lot, I might divulge that a little bit more than if I don't really feel like it's going to be relevant. I don't need the grace. So that's something to just keep in mind too, is context is kind of everything.
So I have a couple of thoughts, and it's interesting because I agree that this is each person gets to decide for themselves what they want to share and why they want to share. And that applies to kind of everything, right? So we could be having the same conversation about what your job is. I know people who do not want to disclose that they have a high school degree and not a college degree because they're afraid they're going to be judged. And that's something they might not bring up until they've been dating someone for a while. Or people who, don't want to have children or do want to have children. That's something they wait to talk about because they want to let people get to know them better. So I want to frame that conversation in a similar way. And what I mean to say is that when we're talking about things that are part of who you are, whether that's a very deeply held value, like having kids, or something that's, part of your all day, every day, like your job, or your identity, or something that affects daily living. All of those things are it's personal and unique to you, right? So all of that, you get to decide. I think that one thing that I usually recommend when people are saying, hey, I don't know if I should, tell people about this or not. The first question that I would ask, and you don't have to answer, obviously, is if you think about why would it help to share? How could it hurt to share? How could it make it easier to find somebody who's going to want to talk to you and spend time with you exactly the way that you are? How might it make it hard for you to be able to be yourself and also be able to find people who are going to be okay with you the way you are? And I think there's a difference between here's me the way I am, literally like my hands are doing all sorts of stuff underneath the camera, being able to be exactly the way that I am, and also recognize there are certain things that are okay to do, when you're around other people, and other things that are going to be people might think it's a little weird, but like, I'm a super weird person. And for me, I am super open about, hi, my name's Barb. I'm definitely autistic. You're going to notice it the first time words come out of my mouth. You're going to notice it the first time you see my body moving. It's just there. And that's an okay thing. And other people don't like doing that, and that's also an okay thing. But I think thinking about why that would be important or not important is good. I'm also going to suggest, if the reason that you might feel like you don't want to talk about your disability is because you're worried that people are going to judge you. There are two things that I can say to that, and these are personal opinions, but anybody else can agree or disagree. Number one, yeah, people are going to judge you. That's a reality of being a disabled person. You're going to get judged. Does it stink? Yes, it does. Is it fair? It is not. And it's a reality. So being able to do a little bit of like thinking about, well, how do we deal with this living in a world where we're going to get judged for things that are just part of who we are? That takes time and practice, and sometimes having someone who listens, having people that you support, and being able to talk through that so that you can build a healthy self-concept, which is also on the screen, and get a better sense of, here's me. This is just it. Here are the things I can't change. Here are the things I don't want to change. Here's the things I might change. And the second thing is, I really believe this. I don't know if this is a fact, but I feel like it's a fact that every person on the planet can, if they have the right resources, if they have the right supports, if they have the right information, can find people who are going to be totally thrilled to be around them exactly the way they are. That is an like 100% belief that I have. Sometimes that means finding those communities of, so if you are a mac and cheese eating, train loving autistic person, like Jessica said, it might mean finding the local train collecting community, because by the way, there is one in the St. Louis metropolitan area. If you are a person who is really into very beautiful decorative like moths, fun fact, like I know something like really excited about moths, there's probably a place, might not be in person, it might be online, where people are really super into moths and would love to talk to you about moths all day long. If you are really into a specific type of music or a specific music artist or a specific hobby or a specific sport, find that like those are your people too. When it comes to like a practical place, dating in general is hard. Dating while disabled is also tricky. There are some specific like dating websites or dating apps that could be, some people like them, some people don't. One is called Hiki, which is HIKI, which is designed specifically for autistic adults, all adults. Some people like it, some people don't like it. There's also an app that's called Dateability, which is DATEABILITY. And that's an app that's for people, lots of disabilities, but if you're the kind of person who wants to be front and center and very open, that's a great option. But some people, like I said, some people like them, some people don't. So that's like my 9 cents.
Oh, very appreciated.
And I think a lot of folks probably want to know about the opportunities for healthy sexuality and how do we set that up? Right? Starting first with access to information, right? How do we set up opportunities for healthy sexuality, starting with how do we set up having these conversations within our homes? Right? How do we set up because I'm speaking specifically to caregivers. It is the caregiver's role and responsibility to give the values to the people that they are supporting. And their person that they're supporting can either choose to live those values or not. But it is really truly up to the family of origin or the chosen family, depending on how much access this individual has to other people, to have information coming straight from a source. Because that source, and specifically when you're a caregiver, you are the source that sets the parameters for the environment. And therefore, if you teach them the values that are that are basically the parameters of your environment, they're less likely to cross those parameters, or at least cross them without knowing, right? So if we've already set a parameter around what healthy sexuality could look like, and the person goes over the parameter, then we can start talking about how that doesn't align with our value system in this specific way. For instance, it could be about, when do we start talking about masturbation? All right. We've already talked about body parts. We think body parts should be introduced in developmentally appropriate stages. So when you're naming the names of all body parts, you're naming the body parts that are also used for urination and for pooping, right? So you're naming all the parts when you're naming the parts. Specific books like that could be like this, that you can introduce at a young age. These are my eyes, this is my nose, this is my vulva, these are my toes. It has pictures. It has different ways of explaining body parts, right? But if we're thinking about masturbation, we're thinking about books like What is Happening to Tom? What's Happening to Ellie? Things Tom Likes, Things Ellie Likes. All adolescently appropriate books that show some cartoon body parts, but discuss the parameters around masturbation and self-touch, including privacy and also the social ramifications or the social issues that one might have if they go against these or violate these boundaries in public. These books are very helpful for understanding that. I'd even throw out Mama, Mommy, and Me, right? So we can introduce different types of family structures and what that might look like. Because as we are more and more open in LGBTQ plus families and having folks with families who have same gendered parents, then we need to also be introducing those kinds of pieces as well, if that is in your family value system.
Something I want to kind of quickly clarify is just the term caregiver, and making absolutely sure that we're acknowledging that, like, caregivers who are, again, family of origin, chosen family, people who are within that role, or those roles rather. Yes, it is their job to be there to instill values, and also provider caregivers. So people who are staff or are therapists, things of that nature. It's not our job to instill our values. So we want to separate out the two kind of category of caregivers there. In caregivers who are paid to do the work, it's their job to affirm and help a client act upon whatever value system that client brings to the table. And so that's something that I just really wanted to highlight, because I know you believe that, Jessica. I just wanted to make sure it was like clarified, because I was like, I just want to make sure. But something that is really, I think, important too, is to acknowledge that value systems, they create an environment, but then the individual, as they get older or as they move through different systems for whatever reason, they're going to be exposed to other value systems. And so over time, values often do diverge a bit. And that's something that we really have to acknowledge, is that parents oftentimes create in their minds this kind of image, and it's almost like a movie that plays out from start to end of how their kid is going to live their life, and the type of adult they're going to grow up to be. And oftentimes that's not how it plays out. And that's not saying that that's a bad thing. That's actually the norm. It's very normal. So being prepared as familial caregivers to instill values, and also not to try and put a person in a box and be like, this is the only way that it is. Because what'll end up happening is they're going to get exposed to other things. And if it's been too rigid here and they've been told this is the only way that it is, and then they see that it can be other ways, it can invalidate a lot of the work that the familial system has done to instill any values. So that's something that I think is just really relevant, is that if values diverge, that's normal. It doesn't mean that your kid, that vision of your kid, it's not dead, and your kid is certainly not dead, right? They're just going down a different road, and so that vision just needs to kind of be flexible and follow their lead a bit when that happens. Oftentimes value divergences start to happen, in teenagehood, but we're also seeing really interesting. I don't think anybody has like fine-tuned the trends yet, but kids younger and younger are getting exposed to outside systems earlier and earlier through their devices, right? And through connecting. And so that's something that we really have to acknowledge, is that, again, even with younger individuals, we're going to start to see, as they explore the world, that they question the values that are being instilled at home. And that's not a reason to freak out. It's a reason to work with and communicate with them and help them potentially understand the difference between what they're bringing and how you see it. But again, saying it's only this way or it's the highway, you're going to end up eventually having a lot of issues with that individual trusting you and potentially adhering to any of the values you've tried to instill.
And I have a specific tagline that I like to use when I'm thinking about this and the way to introduce it. So acknowledging that other things are happening in the world, and also that this is what is acceptable in our family. So I know that this happens in the world, and in our household, this is what is acceptable. This is what is appropriate. This is what we think is okay. Right. So introducing it as, and then so you acknowledge that these other things are happening in the world, but in our home, we believe this. And that gives them the concept of what is the parameters of my home. So what are my rights and responsibilities? It also gives them, this does exist. It validates that what they saw, what they interpreted from the environment was real. And even though it didn't align with their values, it was real and it really did happen and it existed. So it acknowledges, I heard you. That's someone who listens. I heard you say it. And also, yeah, that totally happens in the world. And in our home, this is how we believe. Now, as you get older and they start to move out of their home and into maybe residential living centers, maybe into roommate situations, the way they want to work through their value system, as long as it's not health and safety, we really need to consider honoring those movements within their sexual self-advocacy, right? And I think that's one of the biggest things I think we would all agree on here, is that we want people to move forward in their sexual self-advocacy, and we understand the parameters of health and safety. Oh, other things to consider in terms of sexuality education and masturbation. Somebody who listens. When you hear someone say, your child keeps touching themselves at school, I want you to start thinking about all the reasons a child could be touching themselves in school. One, they could be adjusting themselves. Things could be getting really sweaty because it's summertime. We could be having a large case of pubic hair. So we need to think about trimming pubic hair, right? We automatically go to the worst possible scenario, which is they must be playing with themselves in public, as in masturbating in public. But there are many other reasons that someone could be touching themselves. And I want us to think about that in age appropriate and developmental terms, to think outside the box. What are the reasons people could be getting erections, for instance? Right? So
Well, if they're in middle school, the wind blew the wrong way, right?
yeah, or the bell rang. And every
Right?
time the bell rings, they get anxious and they get an erection.
Pretty much anything can cause an erection when you're going through puberty.
And then we have a lot
I-
of questions about whether or not we're sexually attracted to certain people when the erections happen. And having these very open conversations at home also save you a therapy bill. But if you're uncomfortable having them, then you reach out to a therapist.
I think something to kind of highlight in teaching about that, if somebody is starting to go through puberty, if erections are something that is on the horizon or already occurring, uh, really highlighting that erections don't mean that your brain or your attraction is aligned with what your penis is doing, right? You're not attracted to the wind. The wind blew the wrong way. You're not attracted to the bell. You're anxious. You're not necessarily attracted to this person. You just got a boner while you looked at them. It can happen. And teaching somebody that erections don't equal intent is really important. Especially, I think everybody should know this, right? People with vulvas should know this too. That way, if they recognize somebody is getting erect, they're not immediately assuming the worst, that this is about them or that this person is fantasizing about them. Certainly could happen. But again, giving a flexible framework of, these can happen for a variety of reasons. Let's address what you do if they're showing up. And the worst thing you can do is wish it away. Because the more you think about your erection, the longer you're going to have it. So we need practical results and practical steps that will result in good outcomes. And sometimes, again, you've got to be comfortable having these talks. You can't have this talk if you haven't already talked about anatomy, if you haven't already talked about privacy, right? Like all of these pieces. And you've had to be someone to listen, or they're not going to come to you for this talk. This is an important talk to have.
Mhm. Yeah, and the same goes for arousal fluid versus just a certain time of the month when you're more lubricated, right? So again, like I'm not turned on, but this is happening, and this is what I've been told happens whenever I'm turned on. But if we don't talk about that with people who have vulvas, then whenever they feel a wetness down there, automatically going to assume I must be turned on or sexually excited by this certain scenario, when in fact, it's just a specific time of the month when you're actually creating that lovely casing around the egg that's dropping out. Sorry, a little graphic there.
No.
Barb?
Yeah, so yep, this is Barb talking. So I had a couple of different thoughts. I'm gonna try to keep them all in my brain. So one thing I was gonna point out, that Jessica just kind of touched on as well is that, like, it's not just a thing, this is not a penis specific conversation, right? That this is something that is gonna happen sort of like across genitals, and the way to be able to make this less stressful or distressing is with information. So that's good stuff. There was something else I was going to say, and it's fully out of my brain. So I'll add just kind of tagging on as far as, what to be talking about and when to be talking about. One thing that I can't emphasize enough to people is that it is not ever too late to learn new stuff. And it seems like people that I talk to are who are supporting other people who are like needing to learn about puberty or needing to learn about what on earth their body is doing. Part of what makes that really uncomfortable is that they themselves didn't have a ton of great education. So, some of the books that we would recommend for using in supporting learning, and I am going to do a shameless plug. Some of the books that we would recommend when we're talking about learning about sex or sexuality or about bodies, that are designed for young people, like they still work if you're a grown-up. It's still going to be good information. And sometimes it's nice to get in a clear and accessible format with pictures. So the shameless plug that I'll share, I mentioned already that I also am the co-host. I don't make any money from this, of a podcast that's called Sex Ed Book Review. And literally, my co-host, the person who kind of came up with the idea, her name is Landa Fox. She's also a phenomenal sex educator and behavior analyst. And what we wanted to do was make a place where we could talk about books on lots of different topics. about puberty, about masturbation, about sexual abuse, about consent, about abortion, about dating, like anything we could think of, and look at books that are available, either, available through booksellers, low cost, no cost at the library. If you are in St. Louis County, I'm going to tell you right now, you're going to be all right. There's a lot of great stuff that the St. Louis Library has, which means it does not cost you money.
And the ARC has a lending library.
And the ARC has lending library,
So does
and
SSD.
and
SSD has a lending library,
and
and theirs
special
has a sex ed section.
Yep, and special school district does as well. I think they've probably finished moving all their stuff by now. But what we do in these episodes where we're talking about specific books is we make sure we're also talking about, what are some things that this book is providing that allow it to be accessible, that we might want to modify if we're talking to somebody with a disability. Is this something that we think would be helpful if you're a teacher, if you're a classroom teacher? Is this a book that would make sense for you to be using? If you're a caregiver, is this a book that would make sense? So if you're looking for that kind of stuff, again, just sharing a free resource. It just happens to be a resource that that I helped to put together.
I wanted to bounce around to something that it was like hinted at in what I said earlier, but I didn't really get there, is shame. And shame is, there are so many lit reviews now out that are demonstrating that shame is at the heart of sexual compulsion and a lot of what people would call sex addiction or porn addiction. A lot of really incredibly cyclical and difficult to get out of patterns of sexual behavior. And when we're getting down to it, what we're finding is it's shame. It's the messages that they were given, oftentimes early on or at first, like time that they brought out what they are into or things of that nature. So again, when we're teaching about values, something to really keep in mind there is as somebody is kind of moving on through life and stuff, working really hard not to imply that things that they can't control that they can. Again, like you can't control what your genitals do. And so you also can't control thoughts or feelings. You can control what you bring into action, but no one can be held like you can think about murdering somebody all day, and that's not actually like intent to kill or like anything that's not premeditation. If you don't act on it, right? Nobody's going to jail for having angry thoughts. And that's because no one can choose thoughts or feelings. You choose what you bring into action. And so I think that that's something that we really need to highlight when we're teaching young people in general, is that you're not going to be able to choose your thoughts, your feelings. Your body's going to do things, and those are going to be things you didn't choose. And also, that's not a reflection of who you are as a person.
And I like that we talked about different teaching techniques. We talked about books. Media is extremely important for a lot of folks. So being able to get into their minds about what they're into, whether it's anime, whether it's a specific cartoon show, whether it is a specific comic, is there any characters you could use to also generalize some of the emotional or conceptual ideas of dating? So for instance, Big Mouth has a lot of stuff on periods, and it's a little dark, but for the humor of some people, they would totally love it and learn a lot about periods, and erections. But again, it's darker humor. One of the most important things, that I want to say also is that you have to meet the individual where they're at in terms of intelligence and understanding, because if you aim too low and you introduce something like one of these little books to somebody who's far more advanced, they're going to cut you off. And if you introduce something too above their conceptual ability, meaning you maybe use big words or it moves too fast, for the individual you're supporting, then they're not going to be able to get what they need to from it. So whatever you use, it has to match the abilities and also the interests of the individual that you are supporting. One thing I like also is car rides and songs. right? We could use a T Swift song and bring that on the radio and say, what does she mean by that? Or we could pull up a song that has something about sex in it and say, what do you think that means? And the great thing about when we're driving and listening to the radio is that we both face forward. We're trying not to look at each other. And when the car shuts off and the door shuts, the conversation is over. So it's time limited. Nobody has to look at each other. And we just ask some questions. And for some people, that's a much more comfortable place. For other people, it's the books. For other people, it's giving them a show or like the social dilemma, for instance, for them to recognize that the social media that they're engaging in is manufactured by an algorithm. It makes you want to choose stuff. So that it takes some of it gives them access to information and takes some of the shame away from why am I always clicking on these things. So again, trying to meet people where they're at and introduce them to information in those avenues and at their level.
So I don't know if anybody saw me mouth when you said the great thing about car trips is, and I mouthed, you're trapped. You can't get out. So yeah, one thing I can't, there can't be a conversation about media and sex, and I'm not gonna chime in and talk about some things in it. One other thing that's very, very, very important to keep in mind, and maybe to use as a teaching tool also, is that there's not a whole lot of popular media. There's not a ton of TV and movies that shows super realistic or very healthy concepts of what relationships look like, how they develop. This is something that I actually use almost like as a reverse teaching tool of like, we're going to watch The Big Bang Theory and we're going to watch these people engage in stalking and notice that if this happened in real life, they would be going to jail potentially. We're going to watch The Notebook. All right. We're not going to talk too long about The Notebook, but I am going to say that if you are threatening to harm yourself in order to get somebody to go on a date with you, that's coercion. And you're not actually like really consenting. If somebody is making you feel scared to say no, that doesn't mean that when you say yes, that you're really consenting. So I use that, like, I'm using that as like a specific example. I mean, we could talk about like the end of Frozen and the, request for a kiss, or we could talk about Outlander if you want, like, and like the request for, like there's so many different like good examples, but there's also like really, really trash examples. And using those as well is really, really good.
Yeah.
I don't want to go all the way down like a sexually explicit or like pornography sort of rabbit hole, but I will say that's a whole other conversation. But if you are supporting a young person who is over the age of like 8 and has free access to the internet, this is something to be aware of. There are some great resources that are available for like, what are some things to be aware of? What are some things to look for? And I can link those. But what I will say is that's a pretty fast track to getting a very unrealistic idea of what sexual acts look like. It's very specific. It's like very one way, and also what the power dynamics in a sexual relationship might look like. So if you are like me and are sort of like toward the end, like caregiving for somebody who is older or in young adulthood, that conversation, if you're comfortable, can be really candid about what are these dynamics like? Why is it designed this way? What are the reasons why they might make it look this way and have people talking and using this kind of language? And that's not a bad idea to consider. And again, recognizing that's a really hard thing. So let me share some specific resources for that.
I appreciate that. I want to kind of bounce over into, again, as we're talking about different ways that we can go about teaching. One of the things that I really like to use is amaze.org. Amaze.org has a ton of videos. I'm going to real quick share the screen. So Amaze, you can come down, you can actually choose different language, which is really nice. Pick whatever. But as you come in here, There's different topics. So you can see like puberty, healthy relationships, STDs, HIV, personal safety, pregnancy, reproduction, gender identity, and sexual orientation. And then there's videos for all of these. And what I will say is anytime you're going to use any kind of video like this, please watch it first. Always watch it first. Ideally, something that I do is I go through and I write out like little timestamps of questions that I'm going to ask the individual to make sure that they're demonstrating that they're understanding the content too. But going through and like, okay, so this is signs of a toxic relationship. Do they even know what the word toxic means? So before we get into this, I'm going to ask them, what is toxic? Right? It's more than a Britney Spears song. We need to get into like what it is. So making sure that the individual really understands what you're going to be showing. Another one, another good resource, I don't have it pulled up, but it's called Story Booth. Story Booth is a YouTube channel. And it's videos featuring stories submitted by kids and teens that then are animated and produced by adults and put out on that channel. And there's a lot of really, really neat topics on there and a lot of very heartfelt personal stories. And I've had quite a few different clients who really, it was clients who actually introduced me to the site. But I've had clients who very much like connect with the material in there. They also feel like because it's told from a kid or teen point of view, that it's not like they're getting preached to or learning a lesson. And the adults who do run that, they do fact check and they don't let misinformation get into those videos. So, you know, if a kid's like, all people are, and then they insert X, they're going to remove that statement, right? Like there's probably nothing that all people are, right? So they go through and they do make sure that the information presented in those videos is accurate. Some of them is like, it gets into some heavy stuff. If you go into Story Booth, that is something too. If you're going to give somebody access to a site like Amaze or Story Booth, know what's on there and if this person can handle all the content, because if they can't, then maybe they don't need to be going down a rabbit hole on that site. There's specific ones about my uncle is abusing me and this is what it was like being abused and then this is how I told, and now that I told, I'm so glad because people got me help. Right? If this is somebody who has recently been abused, you know, that might be a hard video for them to just accidentally click on and watch. So making sure that you're aware of content when you're going to share that kind of thing. But there are good videos out there.
And we want them across the lifespan too. So when we think about like some of our older folks that are getting into a time frame when they're hitting perimenopause, and when their bodies are changing, we're giving access to information. We're finding things that might be helpful for them as well. So we're thinking about this across the lifespan, right? We talk a lot about puberty and we talk a lot about building relationships, but when our bodies start to change through menopause, that's a very important thing that many of us leave out of conversations. And it creates a lot of hormone disruption and medicine disruption and different pieces that might be important to speak on. Specifically, I'm thinking about stories like an individual who had been having accidents in her pants when she was not usually having them before, but she would have them at times when she was really angry. She would make sure to soil herself. But when she wasn't angry, she was starting to soil herself a little bit and didn't know why she was doing it. And come to find out, it was part of, again, her urethra leaking. So it didn't have anything to do with an attitude or anger or frustration. And because of the person's inability to communicate this, it was automatically assumed that it was an aggressive or a way to get back or make things harder for the individual. So also, as we see people are aging, giving access to that information on menopause, making sure it's appropriate for the individual that you're supporting as well. So they're getting all of that access to information. And then and when we were speaking about pornography, giving our values around what we think pornography is or isn't. Knowing what you're ready and specifically asking things like, ask yourself things before you are, as you are watching the material or before you're introducing some of these questions, ask yourself, who are the people that need to be at the table to help me answer this question? I can answer it by myself, but who are the other people I want to phone a friend and ask about? Do I talk to my partner about what we think love is? Do we talk to them about what we think is a good time to be sexual with someone? Do we talk about when is a good time to move in with someone in advance so that when we talk to the person that we're supporting, we have an idea about what our value system looks like as we're starting to build relationships? And asking them what relationships you want to be in and how do we get there? What do those steps look like? Making sure that what information you're giving falls in line with your values.
And I just want to talk about, Jessica brought up perimenopause. I was like, ooh, I'm gonna talk here. Hold on. So I was gonna say that couple of things just important to keep in mind. First of all, if perimenopause specifically or menopause is a topic where you're like, I need to come up with a way to talk about this and explain this for somebody who maybe would benefit from having things broken down or explained in a visual way. There is a new-ish book that is designed for adults with intellectual or developmental disabilities. I shared already the sex ed book review thing that we just reviewed it, and also some other books. But specifically about what menopause is and what perimenopause is and how that all works. But one thing that got me thinking about, since we're talking specifically about disabilities, and since one community that I tend to support a lot is autistic folks, I want to point out that for autistic people, the things that kind of come up with potentially with puberty and menstrual symptoms, and definitely with perimenopause and menopause symptoms for people who are autistic, it's worse. Like those symptoms are actually a lot more pronounced. At least that's what like emerging research is saying. So I just shared a little bit of that research if you're a research kind of person. And then also this is if that's a topic that you're very interested in, you're supporting somebody who's going through puberty and is going to be doing some is going to be, needing some education around menstruation, and you're like not 100% sure what this is going to look like, and that person is autistic, there is and I mean hot off the presses, like the research is being done now, but you can follow along in real time, that is out of, oh gosh, I can't remember, University in Wales. But I'm sharing the link for that if you're really excited about it, because it's cool to be able to, we don't know exactly how things are going to be different, but we do have good evidence that those experiences are different. Which leads to like a second thing. Sorry, I'm going to jump on now that we're talking about puberty and we're talking about disability and where these things kind of collide. You're, I think, talking earlier about how sometimes like behaviors could, like things can be perceived in one way and like it may be meaning something different. And I wanted to just really reiterate or iterate that sometimes things that we would call like problem behaviors, these are also things that are gonna happen just like during puberty, right? I spent a lot of time teaching middle school and high school, teaching music, side note. And I can tell you right now, like that's sort of a common thing for teenagers in general, is more irritable and more crabby, and more likely to be, yelling at people or cussing people out, or it's just like sort of a piece of adolescence across the board. So when we see, oh, there's way more aggression that's happening in, and it's, oh, well, we're talking about a 15-year-old. Yeah, that's lots of them. Doesn't mean that we're going to allow people to be, causing harm to somebody else, but it is a way again, to kind of normalize things a little bit and just recognize that potentially this is something that is a little bit common, right? It's like a common experience. So, yep, that was just the piece I wanted to chime in.
To build off that, one thing we have not discussed is the opportunities during puberty to explore our identity in terms of gender as well, and the newly emerging research that we are finding more folks on that identify as trans that also identify as autistic. And for some people, this has been very eye-opening. For other therapists, this has been a long time coming to see the research. And people can argue for a variety of reasons why folks are more likely to identify as somebody who is non-binary. That this period of identity for some folks, when their child has already walked a path, or they've already walked a path where they have been poked at or made fun of or made to feel less than, that when we're also adding another layer of minority status to an individual, we're going to see more behaviors, particularly in frustration, possibly, and depression. These things we might need to watch for. Because again, as somebody's trying to explore their identity, many parents go to a place of health and safety. I want to be careful about where my child wants to wear specific clothing or what accessories they want to wear. And this is something that we can't go into a lot of detail in the time that we have. And this is why a therapist would be really important to help folks navigate. How do we help support the person that we know has some abilities to communicate, but also to be misunderstood, but also to be out in the community in what they want to wear and how they want to present, right? How can we marry these two things, for lack of a better word, to make sure that the individual gets to express themselves the way they want and is also safe within their community? And so we can get creative about these things. But for many parents, this is a huge hard stop for a lot of folks because they are afraid that on top of being autistic or on top of this other disability, that there is another part that is going to make them more secluded from a group. Yes.
Oh, I'm so ready to bounce off of that. Thank you, Jessica. Oh, good stuff. Because realistically, yes, tons and tons of autistic people identify as some kind of LGBTQIA plus. We're looking at upwards of half or more identifying in adulthood. And so that's a huge thing because it is actually just as common to be queer if you're autistic as it is to be heterosexual. So maybe even more common to be queer. We still have research out on that. So as we're teaching values and trying to avoid anything that would bring shame, if we're teaching very specific, rigid, gender-based constructs, especially with autistic individuals who might form rigid constructs that follow them through the lifespan, we could be really doing a disservice. There was a literature review in 2018 that demonstrated that comorbid, which means at the same time, autism diagnosis and gender dysphoria, which is it's different than being trans, but it accompanies a lot of people's trans journeys. And it's a horrible condition to experience. Transitioning is actually the cure for gender dysphoria. But the comorbid conditions make them the most likely adults out of any comorbidity in the DSM-5, which is it's a diagnostic manual, out of any comorbidity, that is the most likely to commit suicide. And that is a really, really really gut-wrenching statistic, especially when we think about how suicide is already a high number in autistic adults. And then we go and recognize that they're not supported in their gender journeys. We're really, really setting them up for potential harm. I think that it's also really important to just really highlight that we meet people where they are. We've talked about that already a few different times. And something that is really, I think, empowering in a way that you can approach this is to not tell somebody what you think they are, but to ask them along the way, and to let them lead. And if they don't have language yet, that doesn't mean that they can't form an identity, but maybe help them build language. And as they express, take what they express and move forward with it. Because affirming a human doesn't mean moving into any specific medical model or treatment. It just means meeting them where they're at and affirming that they did come to someone who will listen. They do have autonomy. They are worthy. And that alone is just huge. And I think we need more of that, especially for autistic adults.
Are you just the last part of what you're saying? I wonder if you have any information that you can share with the folks who are listening about what the impact of just having someone validate experience is just in
Yeah.
general life
Just having
outcomes.
just one person in the environment who is validating reduces suicide risk by 300%. I didn't know before I got into this type of work that you could have more than 100% of something, but you can reduce it. So they are 3 times any queer individual 3 times more likely to engage in self-harm or suicidality than any of their neurotypical, sorry, not neurotypical, their heteronormative counterparts. And so having that affirming person brings that suicide risk way, way, way back down into the normed range. They need to have at least one, at least one. But ideally, something that Jessica brought up earlier that was important is generalizability and the ability to maintain your sense of self across contexts. And I think again, the more people in that village who can affirm, the better that will be.
Yeah, an example, when my child said, "Who am I going to marry?" Right? As a child, said, "I don't know who your romantic partner is going to be." Right? It did not state a gender. It didn't state a concept like you're too young to get married. I validated what I heard and said we haven't met that person yet. And also screw Disney because they're setting us up for failure immediately. It's like marriage everywhere. Because that's how my child got introduced to marriage is Disney, I'm sure.
That's fair. I was 3 when I told my mom I was going to grow up to marry Prince Eric. To which I got the response, "No, honey, you just think he's cool." No, no. So
And
it's one
also,
of
the
those
more
things
we
again.
push back, right? We know the more we push back with adolescents, especially on their identity. If they're saying I'm trans, if they're saying I'm straight, gay, bi, whatever they're saying, the more we push back and say, no, you're not, the more they dig their heels in and say, yes, I am, and I'm going to prove it. And sometimes they do that through these self-harm attempts or these very flashy ways that people think are too flashy, right? They start decorating their nails and they start doing all of these pieces. And again, giving it too much power and trying to crush their parameter a little bit smaller, they're just going to act like any other adolescent and they're going to push back. And there's not enough energy in the day to have that kind of battle. So it's better to just try to aim for a general neutral approach and give you the parameters of safety without aggression.
Again, at the end of the day, if what you're doing is you're trying to keep your kid safe and you're trying to help your kid grow up to be an autonomous individual who's going to have a life that they will value, then taking this approach is really that's how we do it.
Yep.
We have to be somebody that they are going to come to, someone that they know will listen, and somebody who is not going to be there to say, no, my values or the highway. Especially again over things that you cannot control. No one controls thoughts or feelings. Attraction and orientation is based in thoughts and feelings. That means that that's not controlled. So again, if we get into that notion that you can control this, you can change this, uh, oftentimes it's because we want them safe. It's because we want them to adhere to those values because we think that that's how we can keep them safe. And so I like to say, the function of your behavior is love, but the topography, what it looks like and what it feels like to your kid is hate. And so we've got to help your behavior match your function, right? You've got to be able to come across as loving and protective in a way that is supportive to this individual, so that they are not perceiving this as a battle. Barb.
Yeah.
Which usually means low tones and not fast talking, very even language and tone of voice, right? So all those pieces, but we do it so that if you don't want to deny someone the opportunity to find that kind of relationship. If you're not on this earth anymore, would you want to deny your child or the person that you're supporting a relationship that would be fulfilling in whatever capacity that they're available to have?
This is Barb talking. I just want to chime in on something that I was thinking. One thing is we're talking about values and like family values and all these things. I think there are also, personal values as a parent or as a caregiver, that are also relevant, right? So I assume that many, if not most, hopefully all, parents have a value of like wanting to see their child have a happy life, having a value of wanting to be able to promote autonomy, having a value of wanting their child to have, independence again to the greatest degree possible. So I just want to throw that out there. Like those are also values, right? One thing I was thinking about this conversation on, affirming and making space for kids to feel comfortable being able to communicate the things that are important to them about who they are. This is a wildly personal thing to share, but it's fine. When I became the parent of an adolescent, one thing that I promised myself, and I think I've done okay with this, is that I wanted to work as hard as I could to make sure that I was going to be the kind of parent that my child was going to want to spend time, was going to choose to spend time with me as an adult. And that was a very deliberate decision that was made as a direct result of having peers, like having friends who don't have interactions with their parents as adults, like on purpose. Like, I don't want to spend time with those people because they treated me horribly. And I think that is also, that's a choice that can be made, you know? So when we're choosing to do something that our kids are saying actively cause harm, we're also choosing that potential outcome. So just a little food for thought thing.
And to end, all you caregivers have the power. You have the power to affect that whole ring of safety, all of those pieces, the opportunity for sex education, someone who listens, the opportunity to give choices. All of those have to do with the environment and not necessarily with the individual. So you have a great responsibility, just like Spider-Man said.
I do see a question in the Q&A. So somebody anonymously asked, what support groups are out there to keep this discussion going, either between parents or for our teens to talk to each other? This has been eye-opening. This is a tricky one because teens talking to each other is oftentimes something that people are trying to mitigate more. um, when I think of parent groups, something that stands out to me is definitely relevant, especially in talking about gender identity and sexual orientation. PFLAG has awesome parental groups, again, because there is such a overlap between the neurodivergent and the queer communities. A lot of groups that are designed to support queer parents are also becoming very neurodivergence affirming. There's locally also a group called MTUG, Metro Trans Umbrella Group. And I have definitely sent different clients there at various points in time because they have specific groups for like trans masc individuals, trans femme individuals. They have I believe like young adult support group where it's like everybody is like 18 to 21. So they have like these different kind of groups that can be brought in there. I was just gonna say another area where a lot of I think there's a lot of potential for socializing and just getting to know other neurospicy teens and young adults is Dungeons and Dragons groups. They can really make a lot of connections there, and I just think that that's a good area to explore different things. If you want to explore being a different gender and like what might it be like, what name might you want, what would it be like to answer those pronouns, you can go do a one-shot campaign as whoever that character is and just spend a couple of hours living as that person. And that's the kind of thing that I think we forget, that like imaginary worlds can provide some very real life validation.
Does SSD, I mean, sorry, does the ARC still have family supports groups? All right. So I thought
Just
so.
I was just gonna say, so we have a few support groups, and we also, I'll first start by saying we partner with the YWCA, and we have an amazing host teacher that kind of talks about these things. There's, I think it's 13 to 17 and 18 up. We have a hybrid version, so you can be in person, over Zoom, whatever is kind of best for you. And they go through a lot of these things, and it's really, really good information. Some things and it's also just a nice refresher to know, like, and just sometimes you can get the validation too, having other people around your age, maybe with similar likes, dislikes, interests, and knowing that you're not alone and potentially making a friend there. And then also,
Yeah, and Kate, speaking of the SHADE program, the Sexual Health and Disability
yes, sorry.
Education Program through the YWCA, which is free. It is a grant-funded program in St. Louis City and County at this point, and so it is a free opportunity for many of you out there to engage in this activity and group, and we should definitely take part of that if you can.
And they can do one-on-one sessions as well as group sessions. So it's kind of, I know that was one question, is what's out there for one-on-one to talk about intimacy, relationships, puberty, and they do have that option as well. And then we have different support groups. I run 1-0 families of kids 7 and under. I also started transition age young adults 16 to 30, where caregivers attend, and you can talk about and meet other caregivers, parents, guardians that are kind of in a similar boat. And we also have supporting older adults. So we have support groups for the lifespan, and it's really nice because it's just good to know that there's other people out there that you can connect with, you feel comfortable with, and might be going through something similar to you. Yes, and thank you so much for joining us today for tonight's workshop and presenting on this such an amazing and necessary topic that I feel like doesn't always get discussed enough, and really should. So thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you.